Revolutionary lovers, lovers of love. What a joy and a blessing it is to be invited to be among you here at Middle Church. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Valerie. And here we are on the 100th day, gathered in a time of great pain, but in this moment, also a moment of great joy, because in this moment, we hold sacred space for each other in this love as doers of the word. Outside this clearing, the whole world is shaking. We are living in a time of war and violence, and amidst rumors and threats of increasing war and violence against women and children, against difference, and against the entire natural world. Such systemic evil requires redress. But let's take 1 minute to come to stillness. If you would, please just put your feet on the floor. And follow the sound into silence. When I breathe in peace. When I breathe out love. Breathe in peace. Breathe out love. And what have we been doing? Come back, come back. What have we been doing? We have been co-inspiring, breathing together to embody revolutionary love right here, right now, as we ask the question of how best do we embody revolutionary love in facing our opponents, in facing those who make war and oppose peace, those who lie, misrepresent, annihilate, and place profit over the well-being of living things, living landscapes, living seas. At the same time, I take very seriously Darnell's point. And the last panel was so lovely. There's so much response brewing in me. Darnell's point that we can be at once the site of oppression, the victim of oppression, and the oppressor. Everyone knows that peace has to begin with oneself, but not many people know how to do it. Thich Nhat Hanh, shown here with Martin Luther King. How do we sustain the biblical gifts of the Spirit, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control in the face of insult and injury to ourselves and others? How is it possible to see and resist systemic evil and remain centered in one's own grounded spiritual ecology as the ordinary aggressions faced by vulnerable individuals and groups continue? When our waking and sleeping energies are absorbed by responding to aggressions great and small, our hearts become brittle, or they can become brittle, and we can lose our capacity to hold that revolutionary love for ourselves and for all that we hold dear. Because as all the great teachers have taught us, compassion begins at home. We must give our hearts ease. If we can govern our pain and meet our grief and loss with compassion, perhaps we can begin to mend. This is a heuristic for some of the work done by the Braxton Institute involving collective restoration, collective deliberation, and collective healing around moral conscience, when it can be found and identified, using the spiritual disciplines of discernment, narrative and aesthetic reflection, spirituality, art and creativity, and especially ritual and embodiment, such as singing. The experience of persons of African descent in this country has much to teach about spirituality and health, and about struggle and praise, about survival and thriving. For it's not enough to survive. There must be joy even in the midst of struggle. Even as we struggle to stay aware and awake, to stay woke. The experience of African American people can teach us much about avoiding psychological identification with the will of the master and how to stay well in the process, about aesthetics and spirituality woven together in the tight nexus of a single song, the song you carry with you into battle. Something to teach about generosity and compassion under fire, when the same battle must be fought and won over and over again. Because this outrage has been lived through before, beginning with the slave trade. And we have a long list of names of those who have been murdered. And already, when Eleanor Bumpurs was shot and killed by policemen in her home because she was behind 1 month on her rent, already there was a long list of names of Black folk who had been killed by police. So despite the stony road we trod, we live in covenantal relation with those who have lived before us. Suffering what we have suffered might suffer at any moment, and far worse. And still they rose. How did they survive and thrive? 3 things. 1, they sang. 2, they formed communities of resistance, as you are forming here, in this space cleared by Jackie, the way Baby Suggs cleared space at the clearing in Beloved. Song has the power to lift, to heal, and to create community spaces. Speaking historically, Black song has offered sophisticated modes of analysis and healing. In times of trouble, we have turned not only to our preachers and our politicians, but also to our song leaders and our poets. I want to say a bit back to Yara. You know, I have an office on Capitol Hill. I run into those congressmen on the subway. And some days, like the day they were going to vote on the Affordable Care Act, maybe, I walk up to one. They have their little pins on, so you know. Everybody's praying for you. But there was one day I walked around the corner to the Presbyterian church because Reverend Williams was there to deliver a moral declaration to Mitch McConnell about Mr. Sessions. And I was one of the last to arrive on the steps of the Presbyterian church. So I was at the back of the crowd. And people spoke brave, courageous words of strong analysis that echoed words I had heard Reverend Barber speak earlier. When they start fighting back, you know you are winning. And with those words, I have been encouraged. Now, I have now sung with Yara in 2 states and the District of Columbia, and I have a feeling that there are more states to be added to this list. But you know, when Yara says, "Don't let me down," she's just training you for what she's going to ask you to do next. Because on that day, we marched into the Senate office building, 500 religious leaders. And we dropped to our knees after Reverend Barber read the moral declaration outside Mitch McConnell's office. Tracy, are you here? Well, I want you all to know that I was afraid. I was afraid. But Reverend Barber said, "No one is going to jail today." All right? And Yara sang. And we'll come back to this because there's something that Audre Lorde said. But in this moment, there's the question of spirit murder. It's not just enough to annihilate the physical body. There's the question of the annihilation of the spirit. Here was a woman, 66 years old, who was 1 month behind on her rent. And she may not even have been served a document notifying her she was about to be evicted before multiple policemen arrived at her doors with plastic shields and shotguns. It's been going on a long time, folks. It is imperative that Americans, all Americans, recognize the imprint of the first Africans brought here and the first white women brought here in bondage. I'm trying to say that the word slavery and the term enslavement has lost so much of its weight until people mouth the words without realizing what they're saying, what they're calling up. We have not moved on. We have made some steps toward fair play, but we have not really moved on. It is ignorant, not wise, to think that we can get on without remembering what happened, who did what to whom, to what success, and for what reasons. It's Dr. Maya Angelou. It's a phone interview that we did together about a year and a half before she joined the Ancestors. So I'm going to just flip through some of these as I talk, and maybe you can listen to me and follow some of the slides as well. But dispersal after dispersal in the African American experience has created many impacts. The policy around urban renewal, urban removal, root shock, the weathering effect, which is accelerated biological aging as a result of environmental racism, toxic waste, police violence, moral injury in war, spirit murder, and related mortality rates. If you understand these things, you begin to understand African American health disparities, which are also related to the use of Black neighborhoods as dumping grounds for toxic waste. This is the research that I'm involved in at the Library of Congress. So through all of these eras, these are some of the things that Black folks have experienced. Now, integration brought people together in an organic relationship. And as a result, our churches were burned and bombed. And it was not enough to burn and bomb and kill these young ladies. I don't know if you've seen the movie Four Young Girls by Spike Lee, but if you did, you know that the degradation went on as their bodies were photographed after they were killed. And the Charleston Nine. Churches are attacked because they are the foundation of the Black struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. And here is the question: what does forgiveness mean? It means, if you kill me, I will rise again. And I love that picture of Thich Nhat Hanh and Martin Luther King. And they grew close together because of the practice of mindfulness, which has so much potential. Thich Nhat Hanh says, mindfulness is the miracle by which we master and restore ourselves, and this we must do continually if we are to love ourselves so that we can distance ourselves from our own anger and potential hate. I went back and reread Martin Luther King's 17 November 1957 sermon on loving the enemy. He's not talking about loving the enemy. He's talking about not hating the enemy. And he says he had to preach this sermon at least once a year. He goes on to talk about the three different kinds of love: eros, philia, and agape. What kind of love do we want to offer the enemy? I suggest to you that it is not the kind where we are bound in psychological identification with the enemy. I suggest to you that there are moments when the 11th mindfulness training comes into play. And here's what it is. Aware that great violence and injustice have been done to the environment and society, I am committed not to live with a vocation that is harmful to humans and nature. I will do my best to select a livelihood that helps realize my ideal of understanding and compassion. Aware of global economic, political, and social realities, I will behave responsibly as a consumer and as a citizen, not investing in companies that deprive others of their chance to live. I think I went the wrong way. So, to come back to song, as I said, in times of trouble, we have turned not only to our preachers and our politicians, but also to our song leaders and poets. In the Black spiritual, God is always on the side of the oppressed. This awareness is part of what enabled Frederick Douglass to resist enslavement, whip the slave breaker, and escape to freedom. And it makes sense in light of contemporary studies of collective trauma and healing. Now, this is what Jack Saul, Dr. Jack Saul of this city, Columbia University School of Public Health, has to say about trauma. He says that while trauma takes away a person's agency, co-creative acts offer the opportunity for bearing witness in relation to others, which in turn establish archives and therapeutic contexts from which new justice-making contexts arise. So while we are weathering in the struggle, and if you're a woman of color in your 40s, on the cellular level, there's a good chance you're about 7 years older than your white female friend in the same economic group. Stay in the storm. Stay in the struggle. Because we can sing, we can build communities of resistance, we can love one another, and in the words of Audre Lorde, we can learn to work when we are afraid the same way we have learned to work when we are tired. Thank you.
Buenos dias, you all. All enlightened, Eurocentric, philosophical thoughts and movements are detrimental to communities of color. All. When the French sing out liberté, égalité, and fraternité, it does not include their future colonies in Vietnam or in Algiers. Liberation, equality, and freedom was only for Europeans, not for their colonized. And here's the thing, how do you develop a way of thinking that calls for liberation but excludes an entire group of people? And the way you do that is by creating abstract philosophical thoughts that are so dense that we have no idea what they're saying, but we say it must be good because we don't understand it. John Rawls, bless his heart, loved by the Wall Street Journal for some reason, is a good example of creating this way of detaching one's consciousness from one's body to create an ethical paradigm that at the end continues to be detrimental to communities of color. By universalizing the human experience based on the social location of white Europeans, delegitimizes the philosophical contributions made by the colonized, relegated to the underside of history. Let me give you an example. Hegel. We all love Hegel. Dialectical history, salvation history. We're all moving towards a better future. We're all moving upward towards hope. According to Hegel, the construct of history is based on a narrative of stages, in where history moves from the east to the west to Central Europe, where it reaches its height. Now, excluded from history is Africa, Asia, American natives, and Spain, because we were too Africanized, according to Hegel. In other words, we are outside of history. History does not belong to us because we are too inferior to even participate in history. And we only participate in history when the colonizer happens to invade us and colonize us. Then we enter the history books. So, why should I be shocked when our oath of liberty and justice for all was never meant to include communities of color? So before confronting our opponents, we need to confront ourselves. I would argue our mind is so colonized that the only way we can talk about liberation is through the use of Eurocentric worldview paradigms that are designed for our own oppression. We embrace Eurocentric faith concepts like hope, which basically pacifies us, leading us to call for spiritual liberation while ignoring physical liberation, believing in the riches of the hereafter than the riches of the here and now. And our minds are so colonized that I have no doubt God vomits over our colonized minds. Jose Marti, which you probably don't know much about, but is probably one of the greatest philosophical thinkers of the last century, of the 19th century, said, "El vino de plátanos y si sale agrio, sigue siendo nuestro vino." Now, for those of you who lack the dexterity to sing in the language of the angels, let me translate his simple verses for you. Jose Marti is saying, "We shall make our wine out of plantains, and if it tastes sour, it is still our wine." And what Marti is trying to tell us, he was looking at his time, the end of the 19th century, and noticing that these philosophical movements that are occurring in Europe are designed to colonize the entire world, and he's saying we cannot follow their way of thinking. We must develop our own way of thinking. This is followed by Miguel de Unamuno, who also says that the Eurocentric idea, the Germanic idea of the rationale is killing us. We need a way of thinking that does not include rational Enlightenment thinking. But our minds are too colonized that we can't even begin to even think what something like that would look like. How do we learn to see with our own eyes? How do we reject the Eurocentric philosophical supremacy that we learn from the moment we begin kindergarten? Now, in a shameless act of self-promotion, I have a book coming out in November by Fortress Press, which is called Embracing the Hopelessness, which begins to look at people like Miguel de Unamuno as a way of dismantling a Eurocentric Enlightenment way of thinking to try to figure out how do we create our own philosophy, one that does not include our own oppression. The last chapter of the book, the title of that last chapter, I cannot repeat in a church setting because there's a certain four-letter word that begins with F. But I have no other word, I have no other intellectual, scholarly word to say in the face of the fact that every 4 days, 5 brown bodies die in the desert. That's the only word I could think of to end that chapter. That's the only academic word that comes to mind. Confronting our opponents. I'm going to ask a few difficult questions, and please bear with me because I don't know the answers. And I really mean this. I don't know the answers. I just want to share my struggle. Cesar Chavez says, I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who's trying to be nonviolent. See, as a man of color, I get concerned that the dominant culture's conversation about nonviolence is to keep me in check. Once Pax Americana is established, nonviolence becomes the moral initiative. From my social location of marginality, I must ask, is the talk of nonviolence a new form of oppression for me? You see, if I get a gun and put it in the face of a 10-year-old and pull the trigger and shoot them, or shoot the child, it's obviously a violent act. I would be called a bad hombre. But if a bunch of white men in pinstripe suits eliminates that child's health care, they're called congressmen. Why is my violence different from their violence? The exception is their violence has been so institutionalized that we don't see it as violence. So I have to ask, if Martin Luther King Jr. is correct that the United States is the greater exporter of institutional and physical violence in the world, then quite frankly, the United States has lost all moral authority to tell me anything about violence or nonviolence. I am a nonviolent man I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man trying to be nonviolent. I remember when I was in Mexico at a Christian-based community, and where a Chiapas rebel I was talking to said to me one day, you know, I went to the government because they were taxing me so much that I was afraid I was going to lose my land. And they looked at me and said, you smelly Indian, get out of here. So I showed up the next day with a bandana and an AK-47, and you know what? They listened to me. We had an interesting conversation. There was something about the threat of violence that get people to the table to talk. Now, hear me out. I'm not calling for violence. I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who is trying to be nonviolent. And I realize that unless blood flows, nothing changes. Unfortunately, it's always the blood of the marginalized, of the oppressed. That's the blood that usually flows, but that's the blood that flows if we hope for any type of change. Because I don't know of any historical account in where oppressors and colonizers said, you know, we have too much power. Here, why don't you have some? Without the flow of blood. I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who is trying to be nonviolent. Good old Southern Baptists, I have to at least do one Bible verse. Exodus 2:11 through 22, and where Moses kills a member of the dominant culture for beating one of the marginalized. And God doesn't punish Moses, but instead calls Moses to lead his people out of bondage. I'm struggling with that verse and what that verse implies. Because to do nothing in the face of institutional violence is to be complicit with that violence. To do nothing allows the prevailing violence to continue. Do I have a preferential option for the oppressed, which means justifying the violence towards the oppressor? That's a hard question. I don't know the answer. I'm just struggling with the question. Moses' act led to his exile and eventually to the exodus of his people. I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who is trying to be nonviolent. I think of people like Nat Turner, the preacher, who led a bloody rebellion against slavery. I think of Moses killing the slaveholder oppressor. I'm not willing to say that neither one of them acted outside of God, because whites benefited from Turner's slavery. Turner was labeled the terrorist and the violent one. Can violence be part of revolutionary love? That's really a hard question. And again, I don't know the answer, because I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man who's trying to be nonviolent. And you know, if I have to die for my faith, that's the easy part. I'm old enough now that, that's okay. It's easy to die for one's faith. But if I'm honest with you, if you touch a hair of one of my children, I will rip your heart out in Christian love. If I'm honest with you. I have to be honest with myself here. So the idea of not being violent sounds great until you touch one of my children. And I have to reconcile that with trying to be nonviolent. I wish I knew the proper ethical response to this. And as an ethicist, this has been my challenge. I don't know what to do. I do know that the discussion of nonviolence should not be left to the dominant culture. It is a conversation for those who are facing the violence, those whose lives are impacted because they live with the consequences of violence. I guess the only thing I could say with any integrity is that I am not a nonviolent man. I am a violent man trying to be nonviolent. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to close your eyes for a second and to imagine Newark, New Jersey. Now open your eyes and look at me. I am from Newark. I live in Newark. I am love. I was born into a family of love. I grew up in a household filled with love. As an adult, I am committed to sustaining and building community. To me, this is love. To me, this is what shields us from opposition. The Newark I know is a city filled with resources. It's a city of diverse, interesting people who can trace their origins from all over the world. Filled with amazing institutions, including one of the heaviest populations of art galleries, a large museum, colleges and universities, unique architecture, and innovative businesses. Newark is a city where people enjoy being civically engaged, despite contrary rhetoric. It's a 227 housewives on Bravo kind of place, and that folks care about who you are, and they will get in your business. I was raised in downtown Newark, at the heart of all of this beauty, productivity, and nosiness. I grew up the youngest child in a tight-knit family, one of the younger children in my extended family, one of the youngest kids in my neighborhood. Growing up in this place provided me with an ideal upbringing in which I was allowed to simply exist. Almost everyone I interacted with knew me. In fact, people could remember the day I was born. I went to one elementary school, the same school as my older sibling, belonged to the same sports teams, sang in the same church choirs, rode my bike down familiar streets with welcoming neighbors. For many people, the first day of school with a new teacher and classmates demands a certain type of orientation, Yet my first days were more like attending a family reunion. You know, the family that you don't really know, the other side of the family, where everybody knows you, but you don't know anybody. They've heard all about your life, but they're strangers to you. Most often I entered spaces never having to talk, always being able to rely on people to look out for my interests, and usually able to escape opposition. This is my Newark. This is an experience that comes with some complications, but I wouldn't trade it for any other. The family, neighborhood, and city I grew up in was complete with protection, hard lessons, and most of all, love. Today I'm here to remind everyone that even beautiful things, love-filled lives, and promised lands experience deep opposition and conflict. I'm also here to suggest that we belong to a people and to a history and a place that provides solutions and lessons on how to deal with such opposition and conflict. That idea, the idea that how to live greatly in spite of opposition, has been provided to us by our ancestors. Many people believe Newark to be a city defined by unresolved issues, an exotic location filled with different kind of people who can't help but oppose one another, a people who only know conflict, a city that is typically portrayed as being stained by deficit, drained of culture, void of conventional ideas and civility. Newark is more than misunderstood, it is consistently insulted and bullied. Its contributions are devalued. Newark has been dragged, as we would say, forced into a particular type of bondage by decades of redlining, white supremacist policies, including war on drugs, mass incarceration, et cetera, et cetera. This beautiful city has experienced serious opposition. Having worked to empower Newark, I too know something about being dragged. I imagine that most of you have your own experience of being dragged and being opposed as well. Even with this, I consider myself to be a freedom lover, a person who has experienced so much love in his life that I work to share this love with the world versus being a freedom fighter. Beyond my daily interactions, my approach to sharing love includes taking responsibility for creating solutions in public policy, politics, and in activism. Our experiences with and our commitment to love will never shield us from opposition, though. In fact, doing this work might bring opposition more closely to us. There are countless examples that I could use to provide and demonstrate how I've encountered tribulations and oppositions, but today I'll briefly talk about two, and then talk about our history and how we can help to look to things in ways that we can solve them. The first incident is when a few friends and I and a few colleagues decided to work on creating safe spaces for young people in Newark. We had just recently launched an after-school program for young people, which is now a statewide after-school program in New Jersey. But we wanted to make something that was more available and supported the needs of lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender youth. The after-school program opened with broad support from the city, officials, the Board of Education, and a diverse contingent of people who were supportive of it. We faced virtually no opposition. The largest conflict that we had was how to raise enough money to support the program. Fast forward a few years later, and we realized those young people needed more than just after-school programs. They needed daily support with their identities and with the resources that they needed to survive. We decided that they needed a school, and there came the opposition. The school needed, as a new institution, needed to be co-located within another pre-existing school. We had developed a concept, and everything was underway. The school had an awesome social justice pedagogy. The money was in place, but their parents and a lot of the community members who were part of the existing school were in deep opposition to the school opening. They created a meeting that was titled really in opposition to LGBTQ students being housed in their school. Our group that had started this school and started the after-school program circulated an email about who could go to this meeting and really talk some sense into these folks who were opposing us. And I volunteered to go, stupidly. That evening when I arrived at the meeting, I could see that the community had come out in full force. The hallways leading up to the auditorium were filled with people. The auditorium itself was standing room only. I sat and listened to multiple presentations on why LGBTQ students should not have a supportive environment, blatantly, and more reasons why such an environment did not belong anywhere near quote-unquote normal kids. In this moment, I realized that I was the only person in the room in support of the new school. Thought about turning back. My first words when I introduced myself to speak to the audience were just an introduction of myself and who I was, and that I was in support of LGBTQ youth. Immediately, without being prompted, there were shouts from the audience, sexual slurs. People who had sat quietly the entire evening started booing and screaming me down. The room became abysmally hostile. I knew I was in a place of opposition. This was not the city that I grew up in. It wasn't the city that I knew. It wasn't Newark. It was a foreign place. Another instance is when I worked for two prominent mayors, as my introduction talked about, in the tri-state area. They're nationally recognized for their innovations and visions, even their social justice leanings. As a specialist in urban policy, it was my pleasure to contribute to such leadership, to increase the capacity of the communities in which they served. And I did this work for a little over 6 years. Like hundreds of other brown and black men across the tri-state area, I became a victim of violent policies such as stop and frisk, verbal assaults by law enforcement officers, even once at gunpoint. All of these experiences took place in public in front of the communities I've always felt loved in, always felt safe in. I spent a career actively working to promote and enhance these places. There's arguably nothing more traumatizing than this, nothing more degrading than being told your existence is dependent on the discretion of a police officer. Nothing more violent, except homicide itself, than being faced with the barrel of a gun for simply existing. These experiences inform me that we have all faced opposition and conflict. We currently live in a state, America, that is determining our ability to exist and working to diminish our potential in various ways. Even with the weight of opposition and conflict, we have the possibility to endure, to empower one another, and to create freedom. And our history tells us this. It is filled with so many examples. Again, but today I'd like to focus on one strategist, a military veteran, a train conductor, a freedom lover, and arguably America's most heroic figure, Harriet Tubman. Often I think about our many ancestors and how they lived, what their expectations were, what they dreamed about. Even though I can't imagine the oppression and traumatic instances that they experienced, I realized that there's something in common that we share with them. We share a common expectation and desire to live in love and to do so freely. Tubman is celebrated as a symbol of freedom because her expectations were so high in an environment with such low performance. She was a person committed to helping those in bondage, and she risked her life to guiding people out of enslavement. Even in elementary school, I learned about her and the risk that she faced. They talked about the mosquitoes and the snakes and the harsh elements that Harriet surely faced when she traveled up and down the East Coast. They talked about the potential threat of her escaping slave catchers who were doing their work for reward money. They also talked about the opposition she would occasionally face from other slaves that she saved because they were fearful of the life that existed for them after enslavement. But what's not often discussed is the personal conflicts and opposition that she faced throughout her life. Tubman was born somewhere between 1820 and 1825 to Harriet and Ben Ross, her parents. They were a loving couple, and all evidence shows that they were extremely supportive of their children. However, they were held in bondage by the Borders family, particularly Edward Borders, who was the patriarch. The love Harriet received from her parents and sibling was challenged by this circumstance. She received frequent abuse from her slave owners as a child. Harriet's older siblings, 3 of them to be exact, were sold away from the family into slavery, and this tormented the very structure of her family. These were probably her earliest memories of oppression and opposition. Harriet and her family were held captive in the Upper South, the state of Maryland, where approximately half of black people living in that state were born free and lived freely. The other half, of course, enslaved. The concept of freedom was something that Harriet could tangibly see. She could see it every day going out into the streets, and she knew free people, so she knew that there was another way of living. As a young person, she started to investigate what the circumstances of her family would be, and if there was potential for her family to be free. And she did this after experiencing even the resistance that her mother would face. Harriet's younger sibling was going to be sold. Her youngest brother was going to be sold at one point. And her mother took refuge and hid the child amongst the free black community in Maryland for up to a month, thinking that the slave owner would change his mind. When they brought the child back, the slave owner, the boarders, had not changed their mind. And Harriet's mother locked herself in the house and said that, if you're going to sell my child, you are going to meet severe violence upon entering this home, as we talked about. This is, again, one of Harriet's first examples of resistance. And she used this example, again, as I mentioned, to confront the possibility that her family could potentially live in freedom. At the age of 15, while running errands for her owners, she was at a local store and encountered an overseer who was attacking a man who had left the plantation without permission that day. The overseer asked for Harriet's help in trying to capture the man, but she refused. And while the man escaped, Harriet suffered a blow to the head by a 2-pound weight that was meant for that man escaping freedom. This is a blow and an injury that caused Harriet severe pain and sickness for the rest of her life. Again, a lesson that resistance can cause potential danger. Again, even though she experienced this, she continued to investigate the status of her family's legal status, eventually enticing a lawyer to work on her behalf. What she found was that her father was guaranteed freedom at the age of 45, so was her mother, and so were all of her siblings. This increased Harriet's anger. She became increasingly angry with the family that was holding her captive. And at the same time, she noticed that the slave owners were continually active in trying to sell her and her siblings into slavery further south. She started to pray about it as a solution, praying that her owners would change their mind. Eventually, she saw this wasn't going to work, so she prayed for her owner's death, and he died. Ironically, this death caused financial strain for the family, the slave owner family, and increased their desire to sell not only Harriet's siblings, but Harriet herself. Even while Harriet was sick, she decided that she was going to take destiny into her own hands, and she escaped, making her way to Philadelphia in a trip that probably took her about 3 weeks. After reaching Philadelphia, Harriet could have easily enjoyed her newfound freedom without serious conflict. She describes the moment she arrived in Philadelphia saying she was a stranger in a strange land. My father, my mother, my brothers and sisters and friends were in Maryland, but I was free, and they should be free. This quote from her is a clear example that shows that she was happy she had received her freedom, but freedom really did not mean that much without her family. She was inspired to take freedom as an effort to preserve her family, so she knew she had to make her way back south. And this began her long career of freeing other folks. She worked for about a year saving money, and within a year she went down to save her niece and her niece's 2 children who were next up for sale. And she did that successfully. Her very next trip was an effort to save her husband, which turned out to be another example of opposition that she faced because her husband refused to go with her. He had found a new wife. Giving new meaning to her quote, her famous quote, "If I had freed 1,000 slaves, I could have freed 1,000 slaves if only they knew they were slaves," right? But she didn't stop there. On that very same trip, she decided to free 3 other men and went back up north. She continued this work, freeing. There's evidence that she freed at least 300 individuals out of slavery on her own. When the Civil War began, the governor of Massachusetts, knowing about her work and extensive knowledge of the South, asked her to be a spy. She gladly accepted. This became one of her many contributions to the United States Army. She destroyed infrastructure, burned homes and buildings, captured farm tools and equipment, destroyed bridges, all in an effort to end slavery. She was asked to go on a mission to South Carolina because she knew that terrain very well. And on that mission, she freed 700 people from various plantations, allowing them to escape to slavery, to escape out of slavery. In her service, she experienced extreme opposition doing this work. One time on an army camp, other freed slaves complained about the compensation that she was receiving because they weren't getting paid. Instead of complaining about it, She decided to forego compensation, thinking that she would be paid later. She never was. And decided to take up work, making money in other ways. So even in her efforts to free people, she experienced extreme hate. Tubman experienced other detractors and acts of betrayal along the way. As an elderly woman, she built a home for the aged and spent all of her savings doing that work and was essentially broke. In an effort to receive more money, two folks from the South had reached out to her. Harriet, knowing about the work of slave owners, and many of them hid their treasures and their money while the Union armies were taking over plantations, she knew about this. And they kind of took advantage of her knowledge of this work and said that, we know where some treasure is buried. If you give us $2,000, we can find this money, and we'll gladly give you $5,000 in return. And of course, she was cheated out of this money and died broke. The idea is that Harriet never gave up on trying to help people, and she never gave up on her dreams. But in doing this work, she always received deep opposition and conflict. She knew that from her very beginnings, the idea of freedom was something that was illogical. Her circumstances prescribed something very different for her. Creating freedom for herself and the hundreds of people that she eventually did was something that was impossible for many people like her during her time. But her responses to opposition and her responses to conflict made humanity far more possible for millions of people. Her indirect contributions to the Civil War freed millions. Her direct contributions leading people on the Underground Road freed hundreds. In closing, I'd like to say that knowing that what your gifts are and knowing that you come from a beautiful place, again, doesn't prevent you from receiving deep opposition, but it does call you to face this opposition and to do so continually throughout your life. The response is, and the results are, freedom for many and freedom for yourself. Thank you.
A few years ago, someone that I loved deeply hurt me. I was lied to, I felt manipulated, and it was someone I loved. So I called a friend, a life coach, a spiritually enlightened and conscious woman, a woman I respected, and told her and asked her counsel. Her answer was, concepts of right doing and wrongdoings always cause suffering, so I can't deal with it. She continued and said, it's all innocence trying to seek peace. And I'm quoting that. In her words, my father who raped me, the person who steals from me, the man who rapes a woman, it's all innocence trying to seek peace. I work, now this is sort of took me back, because I work in conflict areas. I worked in conflict areas, and I worked with women in Congo and Rwanda and Bosnia and Afghanistan, where they were raped and cut and hatched and loved ones killed in front of them and pillaged and burnt. And if I tell them this is innocence trying to seek peace, they will spit on me. They will despise me, and they have the right to hang me, actually. It's a complete disrespect of those who are facing injustice. So, but also, if I go back to my own home country, Iraq, where I was there a few months ago, and the drive from the house I grew up in, which has become an execution center, a brothel, a military base, my own family home, and the drive from that home to the front lines with ISIS, 3 hours of drive, where I passed by every town, village, city, school, mosque, homes, palaces, stores. They are not only destroyed, they are leveled down. 3 hours of drive of my memory. And if I go to Iraqis my fellow citizens, and I tell them this is all innocence trying to meet peace, they will hang me. They will despise not only me, but anybody who claims that love is all about love. Now, I do believe love is bigger than all. I really do believe love is bigger than all. But I do believe there is a right and the wrong, justice and injustice. And I think when we hide behind love, we insult love. This is a time of fear. We can hide and say, it's all love, 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 which I think a lot of people in this country do. Love, 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 love is all good. Or we address it and look at the issues of injustice and fear in the eyes. As a Muslim, my heart is broken these days. And it's broken not only at the demonization of the religion from outside, it is broken because the religion is in conflict right now within itself. To tell you that Islam is all about peace is to whitewash the violence that is actually happening in the name of Islam. So I don't want to lie, but it's breaking my heart that this is happening in the name of my religion. A religion that I actually see its beauty. I really see its beauty and its grace and its kindness. And I also see the act of horror that is being committed in its name. So in seeking to understand that, I went to France. And I tried to understand why people are being radicalized. Why people are shooting in France so many terrorist acts. And they're all saying, Allahu Akbar, in the name of God. God is great. And it took me a really long time to go to get people to speak with me and to it was a journey of a leap of faith on their behalf in me and of my behalf in them. And I finally got to speak to the mother and the sister of one of the people who committed the Vatican Act, who killed 130 people in France about a year and a half ago, less than that. It was a September 11 of France. And I was genuinely curious to understand why. Because his act was a violation of me as a Muslim, not only of me as a feminist or whatever, or a citizen, of me as a Muslim. Beside a violation of France and of citizens and of civilians. My philosophy about fear is that rather than hide it and do this, go through it, face it and look at it in the eyes. And that's what I was trying to do with the family. I entered thinking it's a family of fear. They're all going to be scary, wearing all black, chadors, all of that. None. There was love in that family. It was actually very weird. For me, it's disorienting because it's a family of a terrorist and I see love. And I try to understand why? Did the role of religion in your upbringing? And they're like, no, not really. We fasted just like I did. We celebrated this, but not just like I did. And I try to ask, are you a good parent? Maybe violence, nothing. And I came to learn slowly that his story that turned him from a normal person in a normal family, just like mine, to a terrorist, started with discrimination. He goes as a teenager in a mall. They say, you're an Arab, you're gonna steal. They tell him liberté, fidelité, liberty, freedom, and fidelity to all, but it does not apply to him. He starts taking the religion, on religion prayers. His family doesn't matter. It's your religion. You're not afraid of your own religion. And little by little, he starts slipping, and that's when ISIS comes and recruits him. So I came to realize that ISIS actually was not the issue. ISIS was taking advantage of the issue. and the issue is injustice. And the issue is discrimination, and the issue is racism. Now I understand, and this is a very controversial thing for me, I really associate with a lot of the things you said, because I understood his journey from A to L. You know, the journey of moving you from a normal person to being an angry person. But I don't agree with his journey from L to W. Because one, we lead with anger. Anger is okay to have because it is the spark against injustice that we do need to have. But when we have anger fuel that fire, we become the very thing we despise. And he became the very thing he despised by becoming the terrorists. I came to realize when he was saying, and all of them, Allahu Akbar, just before they committed crimes, they were not saying God is great. They were saying, screw you all. That's what they were saying. It's a subtext, it's a subtitle. But what he did, he lost himself in the anger. And he lost his religion in the anger, and he lost a sense of the right and the wrong. And that's what happens when we lead with anger. So do I believe that love and revolutionary love? Yes. Because when we don't follow that path, we lose who we are. But what do I tell the women who told me it's all innocence trying to meet peace? I say, come back to this earth. Humanity needs you as human beings. There is right and wrong. There is injustice. It's how we deal with it is the issue, is not denying it is the issue. So how do we deal with it these days? I have been under political depression since the election. As a woman, as a Muslim, as an immigrant, as a refugee, I felt at a loss. I felt speechless. Well, how do we do this? But the loss for me is not only at Trump. The sense of speechlessness and also anger, to be very honest, is at the liberal side as well. We are now using him as a hanger for all the stuff we have, but we co-created today. We co-created this story and we each own it. I am one of those people who had a self-righteousness about me. After all, I am from Iraq. I'm a woman of color. I'm a feminist. I started Women for Women International and helped 500,000 women and distributed 100 million people. I judged the other. I judged them and I looked down at them and I despised some of the ideologies they stood for. But how is that different than them? How they looked at me. I came to realize we all want to be Schindler in Schindler's List. But if we don't have the courage to speak truth to our own selves and to our own families, and if we don't have the courage to speak truth in our meeting tables, how do we expect that we have the courage to speak about injustice in front of power? If I once dreamt that we must forgive even when not asked for forgiveness. I was like, no, this is too much. I'm dealing with it. I was like, this is too much to ask. Forgive even when not asked for forgiveness. You know, and the dream kept on saying, you must forgive even when not asked for forgiveness. Finally, I did not understand what it is. Honestly, I thought it was about Sunni and Shia forgiving each other for centuries of fighting. I thought it's about Muslims and Jews forgiving each other for Palestine and Israel. I thought it's about Hutus and Tutsis forgiving each other. And I would give speeches about forgiveness. advocating for Mandela's voices and all of the, and Gandhi and all of that. But I could not forgive that same person who hurt me, a man I loved. How can I forgive my enemy if I cannot forgive the most intimate hurt that had in my heart? And I couldn't do it. To be honest, I really couldn't do it until I had to ask myself, well, how have I betrayed myself? And that's the hardest journey, the journey to the self. So we can point the finger as much as we want at all the wrong that is happening at ourselves, around us. But try to point the finger here. It's pretty bad. When I was married once, and after my divorce, I thought like he's out of the house, I'm all okay. And then one day I found myself irritated, and there was no man to argue with. Nothing, no husband, nothing. So I remember my finger gaze like, oh no, it's me. When I realized the points of myself that I had betrayed myself, the moments that I allowed to silence the instinct that said this is wrong, the lack of courage when I let something wrong happen and did not say it and did not stop it, when I doubted myself, when I let people take advantage of me and did not stand up because I wanted to be a nice girl that everyone would love, because I was embarrassed of being the angry woman. I did not want to be angry. That's how I betrayed myself. It is the insecure woman in me, the insecure girl in me who wanted to be loved. And when I saw that part of me, I could forgive her. And when I could forgive me, actually he was irrelevant. I could forgive him as well. But more important, I could forgive the larger enemy. I could now forgive the Sunni and the Shia and the Hutus and the Tutsis and the Muslims and the Jews. I could forgive that. But up until that moment where I could learn to forgive me for what I have done to me, I could not. All of these concepts were theoretical, intellectual concepts. So do I believe in revolutionary love? Of course I do. But I ask that this moment in history, this moment on time, we have two ways of fighting. We have the fight against, or we fight out of our own integrity and values by owning the good, the bad, and the ugly within. I used to think of the world as good people and bad people, until I came to realize the good and the bad and the ugly is everywhere, including in myself. And so yes, I used to think it is the colonized and the colonizers as a colonized person, but I no longer think that. I think we do injustice to ourselves as well, and we need to own our own shit as well. And only then can we stand up and we fight. But we fight from owning who we are, from the core of our spine, from the core of our values, and owning everything in us and not making ourselves victims or victimized. That, for me, is revolutionary love. We must build a bridge. In this time, we need to build a bridge more than any time. In a time of fear, the only way forward is to have the uncomfortable conversation. So build a bridge. They will destroy it. Build a bridge again. They will destroy it again. Build a bridge until so many people are part of building that bridge. It cannot and will not be destroyed. That is revolutionary love. Thank you.
And I apologize for the reference to Flint, Michigan again, but the two mothers who initiated the biggest national call to our problem in Flint are now probably the biggest enemies I've ever known. And many different groups who are concerned about the water in Flint have more animosity between them than we have for the state that created this problem. So, and I'm sure that's nothing new. I'm sure that, I mean, I've wanted to have a conversation with Martin Luther King. How did he deal with that? But the other sort of flip side of the coin question is, one way to bring people together who are fighting is by helping them identify a common opponent. How do you help identify the common opponent while at the same time try to encourage people to be loving toward that opponent? Because it seems to be that the uniting factor is, let's all recognize who the bad guy is together. But when you say, and what we will do together is pray for that person or have a conversation with that person, they just fall away again and start fighting with one another again. So I guess my two questions are, when your co-soldiers are also opponents, how do you deal with that? And then how do you help a group of people who are trying to come together not they will be energized by their common anger, but how to be able to commonly together love the opponent? Thank you.
First of all, I understand the people who actually hurt me the most were women, and I dedicated my life for women. So it's understandable that the people who started the cause could be damaging as well. I don't think we need to mobilize around opponent. I mean, for me, is how do we understand? I actually don't believe also, although I did pray for my opponents. I was in Mecca recently, and when you go around Mecca, you pray, you hear people praying for them. And so it's like I'm praying for my family and myself and my loved ones and all of these things. And then I started praying for my enemy. And I'm like, why would I pray for them? And I realized my enemies actually are my family. I think of them every single day. So they're very much part of my life, so they're like my family. I was praying for them, but not in like enlighten them, but just more like praying for them. What I'm trying to say, if we own all our shadows, then the conversation becomes not about convincing you to come to my side or me to go to your side or the other. If I own my own things and understand the times I imposed fear and the times I betrayed and the times I forgave and the good and the bad in myself, and I am transparent about it as I am talking, then that, for me, is a new bridge of communication between each other, where it is not about mobilizing around an opponent. Because we can't afford having an opponent right now. We are I've never seen the world so divided, and not only in America, all over the world. So we can't mobilize like that. We have to mobilize in a way where we can find the connection. And the connection is not in that I am right and you are wrong. The connection is how I own my wrong and how I own my right, to inspire you to own your wrong and to own your right. I don't know if that's my way of dealing with it.
I'm thinking that sometimes a pause is useful. And that perhaps it would be possible to encourage the parties who have a common goal, perhaps, to take a moment for reflection independently of each other, to be in a position to put their flowers forward, as Thich Nhat Hanh might say, and not to present the garbage that will inevitably come up if the kind of introspection that you suggest doesn't occur. And also to be aware that the struggle is long. And it's not always going to happen in the time frame that we imagine. And sometimes a pause can be beneficial.
Amen. Thank you. And if you'll just find a way to a mic if you have a question, and if you're more of an introvert, know that later on in today's listening circles, you'll have smaller groups to talk about your questions and answers. Go ahead.
Hi, for Dr. De La Torre, I'll take you on your word that you're a violent man who wants to be nonviolent. I realized as I was listening to your words, I sensed a sort of violence, and I wondered if it had to do with, as a woman, being aware that your words were very male-focused, the people you quoted, the people you referred to, and when you spoke in general terms about people, a lot of times it actually was about men and calling men people, and so I just wondered if, in that desire you claim to want to be nonviolent, if maybe continuing expansive womanist awakening awaits, or if that's, I mean, I only heard your words, so, but I'm also struggling, I don't even know if it's my place to say it out loud in this, I'm hearing a lot in all of the talks about claiming who we are, so I almost didn't come up and say anything but I thought, hey, towards conversation, I don't know if.
Well, I think it's an excellent question. And I think I'm revealing the deep struggle that is occurring within my very being. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I could definitely come here and we could all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and be very happy. And I could say all the right religious things. But to speak about a social location in where violence has always been part of my life. And Paulo Freire talks about this, that when this becomes your norm, all too often, you copy those very structures. So part of the decolonizing of my mind, and you know, when I'm speaking about this, I'm talking about myself more than anything else. How do I begin to learn to speak and see and think apart from the very violence that has constantly surrounded me?
And so I don't know how much womanist works you saturate yourself with, but I was inviting that possibility. I won't call it a hope because.
Yeah, no, don't call it hope. There is, well, for example, there is no doubt that one of the major individuals who have influence has been my intellectual mentor, Katie Cannon, who I studied under when I was at Temple. And people who I've written books with, like Stacey Floyd Thomas, was also one of my conversation partners. We don't agree. We love each other, we just don't agree. But we are in that struggle. I'm not there yet. And I'll be honest with you, I'm just not there yet.
Conversation.
And that's why I'm saying that when I have this conversation, it is really meant for my community to have the conversation. What I did was I allowed people who are not part of my community to listen in. Not necessarily to tell us how to do the conversation, but to listen into the struggle of the conversation. And that's very different. Matter of fact, when I write a lot of my books, I'm not writing to the dominant culture. I'm just writing to my people and letting other people to just listen in with all the messiness and the contradictions that bring. One of my favorite philosophers, Miguel de Unamuno, would always say, "You accuse me of paradox and of contradictions. What else do you expect? I'm human." And I'm embracing that humanity with all of its flaws. And that's when I'm talking about the new way of doing philosophy, as opposed to having all the dots connected.
Hadaria, go ahead.
Okay, so I want to address both Dr. De La Torre and Ms. Salbi because I think I juxtaposed to both of what you presented, and it really does hit home. First is the intersectionality of all of it that we discussed earlier. As a woman, as an urban woman, I resonated with the conversation of I am someone violent who's trying to not be violent, because maybe if you are an urban woman, you might have had to have been violent to survive. And so my thinking about womanism is not sort of like, it looks different, right? I mean, if you had to live in the ghetto, you may have had to thrown down, and that was part of the womanism. I also thought about when you were speaking about Audre Lorde and her whole life, when she said, you know, self-preservation is the most revolutionary act of love. I thought about the Pax Americana and how after Manifest Destiny is completed, then everybody should be nonviolent. So after you've conquered me, we should all be nonviolent. I juxtaposed that to like those conversations about nonviolence and ahimsa, and we've had conversations of when is it not okay, but when is it necessary? And I think about Ms. Salbi. The tough part about it tends to be, if you need to stop the violence, sometimes you have to be violent to stop the violence. But in doing so, it's almost impossible to then stop that, ending that moment of violence. Once you enter that stage, it is extraordinarily hard to step out of it. And I understood that, and I think the two conversations there as counterbalances is a really good beginning, because I don't necessarily want all the tools off the table. I don't want to run around and get guns, but nor do I believe in being simply a sheep or a lamb to the slaughter. I do believe in my right to defend and protect myself, but I'm cognizant that when you enter that space, it is hard to stop at protection and not move forward to now being a perpetrator. And I think these 2 points, and Dr. Braxton's point, is where we need to come in and deal with the healing. After you may have had to protect yourself, there is literally a trauma in actually doing that, and how we bring this together in the healing dialectic. I don't know. That's my struggle, because all of it is very connected in listening to you all speak. Maybe that's something to think about. Maybe y'all should write together. I don't know.
It would be a pleasure. May I? For me, it's not about the other, it's about the self and my values. A Palestinian man that I recently met talked about how an Israeli soldier killed his 9-year-old daughter, shot in the head. The daughter was passing through curfew, so it was a child walking through curfew, and the Israeli soldier shot her. And as a Palestinian, there's a lot of pressure on him to get revenge. So he talks about how for the first year, his 13-year-old son wants to join the Intifada and wants to shoot the Israeli soldier and wants to all of that. And the father is talking, saying for the first year, what was he occupied with is how to keep his family alive. Not for the son to go and join the militias, and not for him to go and kill, because he said, I had to fight in another way. Because I will lose my family, I will make them orphans if I go and kill the Israeli soldier. So he finds the Israeli soldier. And he goes to him and he tells him, I am the father of that child. What you have done is criminal. No soldier should kill a child. This is like period. What you have done is criminal. You need to learn to come to forgiveness to yourself for what you have done. The day you do that, come to me. I am her father. I will forgive you. But I will not give you my forgiveness now because you don't deserve it. Now, that's not the story I wanted to say. This is to the Israelis. He was then telling to the Palestinians, do not use the picture of my daughter and put the slogans of the revolution on her forehead and use her to justify anything. She is a martyr, but a child martyr. The point is, his message to his Palestinian community is, when we are fighting, we are losing. So we will fight. We are occupied people. We need liberation, but we need to fight in another way. When we are fighting with violence, we are losing. They are stronger. We are losing our families. We are losing a sense of us. So we fight. We need liberation. We need to end the occupation, but we need to fight in a different way. And for me, these are the people who change the world. It is the Gandhis who changed the world. And he fought in a different way. Not in reaction, but in action. So I'm not denying the anger. God knows I have so much anger at injustice in me. I'm just saying we then slip into the narrative when we become the terrorists. And we will fight differently out of our own integrity and create another story.
If I could. If I could ask something, because you mentioned you're an urban woman that's trying to survive, and maybe also to connect it to the earlier question. In the book where I discuss some of these ideas, I begin by saying I am Milta's child. Milta, who was my mother, was an illiterate woman from the hills of Cuba who never went to school and was sold when she was 10 years old to be a domestic worker in where she was physically and sexually abused. When she came to this country, she could not speak English here in New York City. And she tried to get a job, and they asked her, did you ever go to high school? And she goes, oh, yes, of course. I went to university in Cuba. And they asked her, well, can you speak English? Well, of course, I'm fluent, even though she just memorized a few phrases. And she got the job as a waitress. Now, as an ethicist, if I was to ask her, well, Mom, you lied. That's unethical. Don't you know what Immanuel Kant says about the categorical imperative? She responded the same way you did. This is how we survive. I have to lie to put food on the table so you can eat. So, if I sound, with an edge to it, it's because I learned from my mother, Milta. I am Milta's child, as I say in that chapter. And I want to be very clear here. I do occupy a male body. Nothing I can do about that. But that doesn't mean that I'm an essentialized male, because the foundation of a lot of my thinking is the survival instincts of my mother. And to dismiss me as an angry Latino then could dismiss everything I'm saying. So please hear me when I really say I'm not a violent man. I'm trying to be nonviolent. But it's not easy. And it's just not easy. And that's what I'm trying to get at.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just happy to be here. I'm a United Methodist pastor. I serve 2 churches in Hauppauge, Long Island, and in Central Islip. This question is directed to Professor de la Torre, and also if the other panelists would also like to respond. Professor, you spoke about speaking from our social context. You mentioned that you speak as a son of Milta. I speak as a son from Águeda Vázquez. My last name is Rivera, but her maiden name was Vázquez, and that's the name that I carry with me. I've rejected the Rivera title, even though I use it when I write it, because Rivera is a name full of violence, in my experience. And you spoke again about speaking from social location. Social location for me is not only speaking from a cultural perspective, but also from language. I'm a New Yorican, meaning an American of Puerto Rican descent, and that's the best definition I can find to define who I am. So from that social location, I would like to ask you a question in Spanish, and maybe you can translate it for the rest of the people who don't understand Spanish. Es un gusto conocerlo a usted, la primera vez que oigo de usted.
Igualmente.
Aquí se habló, bueno, usted comenzó parte de su diálogo hablando sobre cómo debemos mirar las cosas desde nuestra propia perspectiva y deshacer esa perspectiva europeo colonial que a veces usamos para juzgar las cosas. Aquí se habló anoche sobre la teología, en forma concisa, la teología de Jürgen Moltmann, y que la teología de esperanza de él, particularmente la teología la conozco a través del libro que él escribió, El Dios Crucificado, y se dijo que se trajo una crítica acerca de este teólogo, y yo quiero saber si Moltmann cabe dentro de su paradigma teológico, si usted también lo echa al lado o si hay algún beneficio acerca de el pensamiento de este hombre, este teólogo alemán.
Sí. No hay ningún beneficio. Short answer, and I'll get to it. He was asking me about Johann Moltmann, who writes a theology of hope and the crucified Christ, which bases the whole thing on hope. As some of you might know, I'm not a big fan of hope. In this book I wrote, Embracing the Hopelessness, it's a whole chapter on Moltmann. I couldn't ignore him if I'm going to be talking about hopelessness. In a nutshell, the problem with Moltmann is that he gives us a process God in where God is not outside of history but part of history and therefore does not know what is occurring, what's going to occur next. And the hope for Moltmann is that God is a God of promise and that there's a promise of a future with God. And when we get there, we'll understand all of history and we'll all be happy. My concern with that is, number one, he believes in this dialectical history of Hegel, which I'm totally against. And more importantly, the God of promise hasn't always kept God's promise. I can't imagine what happened to the God of promise when 6 million Jews were gassed. And it's not that 6 million Jews was gassed as, and I forgot the name of the thinker right now, and I apologize, but somebody else said, it's not that 6 million Jews was gassed, it's that one Jew was gassed 6 million times. To put it into an individual because the number's too abstract. And so what I'm asking is, God was absent 6 million times. So I am wrestling with a God who sometimes does not hear. A God who Jesus had even had to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So it's okay to have a salvation history if you're white and you have a future because you could go to college and you could have all the benefits that society has to give you. But when you have to survive and God is not present, that's when faith and the rubber meets the road. So Moltmann is great if I have the privileges that Moltmann has. Moltmann discovers Jesus while he's in a camp, in a prison camp in England. So I have to ask, so God is in the prison camp in England but not in the concentration camp in Auschwitz? What's with that? So this whole idea that I'm wrestling with hopelessness, it's also really wrestling with a God who sometimes doesn't bother to answer my prayers. And the beauty of all this is that God is not afraid from my struggle and my questions or my cursing at him or cursing at her or cursing at whatever. God's okay with that. And one of the things I want that instead of Moltmann, I do a switch to Miguel de Unamuno, who writes this beautiful poem about praying, the atheist's prayer of praying to the God who does not exist, and struggling with a God who may not even be there, but that's not the point. The point is, I'll still pray to this God that may not even exist. So yeah, no, Moltmann is not exactly one of the foundations of my thinking, to say the least.
Okay, thank you. Muchas gracias.
De nada, un placer.
David?
Yeah. Hi. I want to speak to, I was particularly interested in this particular session because of the confronting opponents, and I want to speak to violence and nonviolence in that I identify with being violent and practicing or attempting to practice nonviolence. And I've never told this story before except to my wife. So, and nor have I ever said this to a room other than a specific place where it feels safe, but this feels safe. An alcoholic is an alcoholic even when they're not drinking. And I experienced not drinking, though I'm an alcoholic, by way of God's will. I started coming to this church a year ago, and not sort of at the same time, approximately a year ago, my violence begins to well up, because I am a violent man. And I have the experience of a past of going after bullies, specifically to stop violence, and it worked. From my youth, I'm from a very rough part of Virginia. So I knew how violence would work against bullies, and it began to well up in me in a way that I had not felt for many, many years during the Trump campaign. And I became so incensed and crazed, truly, right? When I would see these videos online of bullies sucker punching people at campaign rallies, or pushing a woman repeatedly at a campaign rally, and I became so incensed that I would start to plot how I was going to go after these people. I became crazy. And it was disruptive to me throughout every single day, and it was disruptive to my family. I became very anxious and just nuts. And it was terrible. It was the violence. I was violent to myself. And then I started coming to this church. And through Jackie and Revolutionary Love, and through Marianne Williamson, who's also up on this stage once a week. So I'm getting this dosage of instruction. And through God's will, again, I'm an alcoholic, but I don't drink. I'm a violent person. I did not carry out my hit list. I had a hit list of how I would plan to go after these people, which is crazy, right? I've got a family, and I'm thinking, I got to go get these guys, like I did when I was a teenager or as a much younger person. And through coming to this well and Marianne's offerings, I then catch on that through God's will, I could do something about the violent man. And I changed what I would do on a daily basis, and I took an image, a freeze frame of both of these guys, these two assholes that had been driving me crazy, and I put them on my screen top, on my computer screen. And every morning I would pray for these two men, as opposed to plan and plot some fantasy of how I was going to go get them back. Now, I know that sounds completely crazy that I was scheming to get these bullies, but in my experience, that's what had worked in my past, and I was thinking that's what I have to do. Okay, so I found that I don't know that I did anything to or for these two men, but what changed for me in my experience of praying for these people is that it changed what happened the rest of my day, and it changed what happened all of the following days. And to this point, to this end, I don't have anybody on a hit list presently, though my anger is great. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Delia Ramirez. I'm from Chicago, and I'm really grateful to have heard all of you. So my question is a little bit more about the opponents. As I sat here, I was thinking about what we heard earlier today and how this microphone keeps falling down. The whole conversation about reciprocal solidarity, what does that look like? And how my freedom actually be a reflection or translate into someone else's nightmare. So as I was hearing all of you talk and what I heard from others before, I started thinking about the conversation of opponent and how oftentimes the opponent is someone that may look like me or sound like me. And so my own bias is I'm hearing you, Miguel de la Torre, and the pastor here, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Guatemalan. Our experience as Latinos of 23 countries is so different. and I'm hearing the conversation about education and your mother having education in Cuba and my mother having a third grade education and crossing the border. So I started thinking, that wasn't until I was standing here that I started thinking about how we Latinos ourselves are wrestling with being an opponent to each other, and how that has always been the ways that we've been divided within ourselves because of our own social location. But what I was going to ask you here was more about Black and Brown Coalition, that I know my colleagues hear me talk about all the time, and how we ourselves see each other as opponents. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that, because what I find myself challenged is that while I'm looking and striving for the liberation or decolonization of Latinos, I am afraid that it at some point could compromise or come at the expense of Black liberation. So how do we ensure that as we're talking about liberation and revolutionary love, that we're able to see that we are not each other's opponents, but we also have internalized racism within ourselves, and how Latinos that look like me have more privilege than those that look like my father. So I wanted to just ask you a little bit more about that. And where do you see models where truly we're building together while having sacred and honest conversations of the ways that we divide each other, or white supremacy continues to divide us?
Yeah, that's right.
Anyone here, I would love to hear.
I think part of the problem is that one of the colonizers' tools that we have internalized is the zero-sum rule, that any privilege that I may get is at the expense of another group of people. So, I'll give you an example. In our library, in the bookstore, if I want to get a book on Black theology or Latinx theology or Asian American theologies, we're all on one shelf. And we're all fighting for that same space on that one shelf. Even though there's a whole bookstore surrounding us, full of shelves, if there's one less Latinx books, that's because they made room for one of those African American books. And therefore, I need to kick them off my shelf so we could have more books there. And as long as we are fighting for the crumbs that fall from the master's table, we would always be at each other's throats rather than working in solidarity together. But I also want to say something about opponents, and because this is also very important, and I kind of talk about this. I mentioned Cesar Chavez before. Cesar Chavez once at a meeting, and all the vineyard owners walked in to negotiate, and one of his colleagues whispered, "Don't you just hate those SOBs?" And Cesar Chavez says, "No, wait a minute. Give me their land, their money, and their privilege, and I also could be an SOB." And what that teaches me, I think, is that they're not so much opponents or enemies, they're people to be pitied. Because if I also have all those privileges, right? Example, you mentioned a light-skinned Latinx. If I was still in Cuba, I would be the SOB because I would have all the privileges to put me on top of that hierarchy. Therefore, it's not an issue so much of enemies and opponents, but an issue of individuals that need pity. And maybe more than anything else, that's what holds back any violence I may have. Because it's an issue of pity, not of hatred. Because there go I as well.
Thank you.
I say, but I'm not a Latino, but I'm a woman and I'm a minority, and this is a politics of minorities operating out of scarcity. But we all have a choice. We can lead life out of fear, and fear is about scarcity. Or we can lead life out of love, and love is about plenty. Now, I'm not trying to be goofy in here, but it's a choice we each have to make. You can't, it's devastating every time women fight over the one seat at the table, or my own people fight with each other, and right now they are killing each other. You can't be, you just build a bridge with your own surrounding. They will destroy it, build a bridge again, they'll destroy it, but act out of love rather than out of fear, because it's easy to slip into that.